Let me see if we are on now. Wait a moment. Okay. So thank you so much, Jikai Dehn, for being here, for having accepted my invitation to the second interview. In this time, we will address the Lotus Sutra and its profound meaning. And so the first question, it's a standard question. I want you to introduce yourself, but because you already introduced yourself in our last interview, it don't need to be a long introduction. So I want to add in this first question the question of why did you become interested in the Lotus Sutra?
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me back. I know I'm not the most interesting speaker, so I do appreciate the chance to share information on the Lotus Sutra with you today. As a brief introduction, to those who don't know, my name is Jikai Dehn. I'm an Australian Tendai monk, and I, of course, did my training on Mt Hiei in Japan. It was actually the Lotus Sutra in particular that got me interested in Tendai, and perhaps even more crucially, in Buddhism per se. Until that point, my exploration of Buddhism was more idle curiosity than a deep conviction. In any case, when reading the Lotus Sutra, I was continually struck by how simple a surface reading of the text might appear. And yet, everything I had learned up until that point suggested to me that there were multiple layers and multiple very clever recontextualizations of things that most Buddhists are familiar with underlying the text. And it was at that moment that I realized that this was something that I absolutely had to investigate further. And it's at that point that I officially began my practice and study as a Buddhist. So you could say that the Lotus Sutra itself was that turning point for me. And I can understand why a lot of people who come across the text for the first time get the impression that it's not a particularly complex, philosophically rigorous sutra. In particular, if you're comparing it to things like the Avatamsaka Sutra, the Flower Garland, or the Mahaprajna Paramita Sutras, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, which go into dizzying detail and concepts like emptiness. But the Lotus Sutra is a little bit more subtle in what it's doing. And I think that's why it is so effective as a hermeneutic lens, as a tool for approaching the rest of Buddhism per se.
Thank you. So the first question specifically regarding the Lotus Sutra that I want to ask, I will start this question in a little weird way, but because recently I watched a Netflix series called Squid Game. It was very famous. It's not so bad, not so good series. It's worth watching. But what struck me about this series is the worldview. And I think it's a worldview that's more and more common today. It's something like we live in a world that fundamentally is chaotic, is a chaotic world. And sometimes we see generosity, a good action, sometimes, but fundamentally, in the core of reality is chaos, is chaotic. It was something that I think it's very dangerous worldview. It's a very dangerous worldview. And I think it's the opposite of the Lotus Sutra worldview, because I think that according to the Lotus Sutra, the core of reality is Buddhahood or enlightenment. So it's a positive view of reality. So I want to ask you, what is the core or the central, sorry for my dog is barking, but what is the core or the central meaning of the Lotus Sutra?
Sure. So as you mentioned, of course, there are extreme worldviews, nihilism and eternalism and those kinds of views which can be particularly dangerous. And I can appreciate how the Squid Game series might have precipitated those kinds of reflections. Perhaps I might start my answer to this question by taking a slight step backwards to make sense of how the Lotus Sutra is doing something special here in its worldview. So anyone who's studied basic Buddhism, some of the primary concepts involved in the Buddhist worldview, will be familiar with things like the concept of samsara, the idea that the world itself is characterized by suffering, by dukkha, that is, by angst, by unsatisfactoriness in one form or another. And much like the other traditions of Indic religions, Buddhism accepts the idea that one is continually cycling within the world of samsara, although there are, of course, subtle differences in what we take that to mean. In the case of Buddhism, we usually refer to this process as rebirth rather than reincarnation, because, of course, in the Buddhist worldview, the fundamental insight, let's say, that the Buddha has initially is the realization that there is nothing equivalent to an independent agent that is in complete control of his existence. And that is precisely why there is this unsatisfactoriness. Because if any being was truly in control of themselves, if some essence that was purely unconditioned, soul-like in the Abrahamic sense, if this existed, then you would only experience that which you chose to experience, because you have pure sovereignty over your existence. That, of course, is not true. Our experience bears this out. And therefore, when we talk about rebirth in the Buddhist worldview and the problem of dukkha, of suffering and unsatisfactoriness, we are definitely not suggesting that there is some you, per se, that is reborn. And that's why we use the term reborn in English rather than reincarnation. Reincarnate implies that something carries on from one form to the other. In the Buddhist worldview, it is only karma in the sense of there can be no cause that does not have an effect, and the complete cessation at death of everything, that is, every causal motion in play by you as a subject, a provisional subject, would be a cause that has no effect. It would be a severing of causality, which is likewise not possible in the Buddhist worldview. And therefore, although you are reborn per se, everything that you think of as yourself, as William, passes with your present body, right? Your memories, your feelings, your ideas, the things that you think are important, all of those things are dependent on the 5 skandhas, including your mind, which passes like any physical, impermanent entity. So, in a funny way, the Buddhist worldview begins with this conundrum. Existence is suffering. Samsara is, in some sense, continual, and you are stuck within this cycling. And yet, everything about you, per se, is contingent, impermanent, and passes with your body. In some real sense, then, the you that might suffer in a future life is not in any way, shape, or form identifiable with everything you think of as you now. All of those things do not pass through. And therefore, we might ask the question, why do you worry about the you in a future life? Right? That's the other guy's problem. It's not you, right, per se. Everything you think of as you is long gone by that point. So Buddhism fundamentally faces this issue, faces this dichotomy and this difficulty. How does the Lotus Sutra respond to this basic assessment of the human condition? Well, one of the ways in which it does that is it recontextualizes everything that I have just mentioned. So dukkha itself is recontextualized. Nirvana itself is recontextualized. And surprisingly, perhaps, the idea of rebirth is continually present in the Lotus Sutra. We have over and over and over again various discussions about the distant past and the distant future and lives of various individuals in the assembly and events that occurred to the individuals there. And of course, while there is a recontextualization, there are certain qualities of that discussion that remain the same. We know that the individuals don't necessarily remember the things that occurred to them in the past, because the usual position in Buddhism is that only a Buddha has knowledge of his previous lives and the previous lives of all other sentient beings and the future lives of all other sentient beings. But this begs a very, very important question. A Buddha is, in the early tradition, somebody who frees himself from this cyclical process of rebirth. And yet a Buddha is the only person who has any knowledge, actual verifiable knowledge of rebirth. In other words, to know that you are a being that is reborn is to be completely removed from rebirth. And anyone within rebirth does not have that direct verifiable experience. Why is that important? Well, there does seem to be a sense in which you and I do care about the future William, the future Jikai, and that we make plans and that we practice and that we cultivate and that we try to better our position, even though we, in theory, have understood that that individual is quite removed, quite different from us as we presently are. But of course, that same insight can be accessed on the immediate level as well. The you 5 minutes from now and the you 10 years ago is quite different from the you presently. And we can divide this discussion as much as we want into seconds and milliseconds and so forth. But to be a Buddha, to have infinite compassion and infinite wisdom, is to understand, therefore, that if there's no identifiable, tangible link between you now and you a moment ago and you in 3 lifetimes hence, then the compassion you show for your future self and your past self by practicing and studying and trying to understand the Dharma is no different from the compassion you show to other individuals. It's the same action, it's the same mechanism at play there. And so in other words, once more, a Buddha, someone who is truly compassionate, is someone who no longer sees a self or an other, because the distinction no longer makes any tangible qualitative sense. I am aware that that was a slightly lengthy preamble, but the reason I did that was because at the core of the Lotus Sutra is a very, very encouraging message. And that is a very simple one, perhaps, maybe not so surprising, because in present Buddhism, this message is now ubiquitous. It is so common across the Buddhist world, but it owes itself in large part to this text. So the Lotus Sutra tells us that Buddhas only teach bodhisattvas. They teach nobody else. Now, for those who are not familiar with the term bodhisattva, a bodhisattva is many things, but in this context, it means somebody who will become a Buddha. That means that you and I, and anyone listening to this talk, who is thereby hearing the Buddha's teachings, is ipso facto a bodhisattva and will become a Buddha. That's a very, very significant message. And to understand how significant that is, we need to consider how shockingly absurd that claim appears to be in a common sense appraisal. You and I, and everyone else listening to this talk, probably has an image of themselves that involves various faults, various predilections, various desires, various shortcomings. And yet, all of the descriptions that we have of Buddhas and high-level bodhisattvas are of supermen, are of individuals with omniscience, with perfect compassion, with foreknowledge, with a great deal of insight, with the perfection of practice, with the ability to apply skillful means to their teachings that allow individuals who are very far removed from the wisdom of a Buddha to gradually progress towards it. He has various what we call abhidnya, or supernatural penetrations, which to anyone unfamiliar with Buddhist texts, when approaching them for the first time, might think of them as superpowers. They literally describe somebody who is not bound in the way that you and I are by normal laws. None of those things are things that you and I usually identify as qualities of ourselves. And yet this is precisely what the Lotus Sutra is telling us is true, not vacuous. The Buddha would not lie about such a thing. So, for example, we're told emphatically in chapter 2, after we're told that the Buddha only teaches bodhisattvas, that the Buddhas, the world-honored ones, only come into the world for one great matter. There is no other cause for a Buddha coming into the world. And it describes this cause in minute detail. It says that Buddhas come into the world because they wish to open up, literally, the knowledge and insight, the jnana darshana of the Buddhas, and cause living beings to be purified thereby. They wish to reveal the knowledge and insight of the Buddhas. They wish to awaken beings to the knowledge and insight of the Buddhas. And they wish for beings to be caused to enter into the knowledge and wisdom of the Buddhas. So this is emphatically stated initially in chapter 2, but of course this sentiment continues throughout the sutra, and very famously the verses that close chapter 16 very poignantly have the Buddha telling us that he forever or always has this thought: how can I quickly cause beings to enter into supreme wisdom and attain the form of a Buddha? Now, of course, there are obvious layers of connection between that passage and the passages I just mentioned in chapter 2, but it goes quite deeply, and I'm doing this simply to introduce the way the layers work in the Lotus Sutra and how very simple passages can actually be quite nested with meaning. So those passages I quoted from chapter 2 say that the Buddha wants beings to enter into, to reveal to them, and to awaken to and enter into the knowledge and insight of a Buddha? Well, knowledge comes from study and understanding, and insight comes from cultivation, from the actual practice. And then when we go to the passage in chapter 16, that very simple, I forever have this thought. How can I cause beings to enter into supreme wisdom, that is, to have knowledge and understanding, and obtain the form of a Buddha? Well, the form is literally the body, the physical, the practice of a Buddha. In other words, the Buddhas want us to be just like them, and they are come into the world for no other purpose. That means, therefore, that any time that you and I described to somebody the great qualities of a Buddha, like those superhuman qualities we just discussed, we probably had nested in our description the assumption that we were quite removed from that. We were talking about the qualities of a Buddha, someone else. But in fact, we were talking about our own qualities, parts of our own character, things that we are the inheritors of. And certainly in chapter 3, Shariputra not only very poignantly points out our fears in this regard. He says, I discussed all of these qualities and taught people about the Bodhisattva path, but I was aggrieved because I knew that I had no part in this. This was not something that I was able to achieve. This was beyond me. And yet now I truly know that I am a son of the Buddha, that I am born from the Buddha's mouth, that I am born of the Dharma's preaching, that I am thereby capable of attaining my part in the Buddha Dharma. And this is an incredibly hopeful message. This is a on the surface very simple suggestion, really, and yet the connotations, the implications of this worldview, this message, are enormous. And just to close that basic introduction off, you mentioned the worldview of Squid Game and the idea of this kind of very fatalistic worldview, and it can be quite dangerous depending on how someone is taking this. In order for that comment by the Buddha to be true, that is, that you and I, with all of our sordid, sick, pathetic lives, moment to moment, in order for that to qualify us for Buddhahood, the nature of the original claim that the world is dukkha, unsatisfactoriness, has to mean something very, very different now. It cannot simply mean the world is terrible, woe is me. And in fact, it's precisely by the world being this way that we are Buddhas.
Yeah, I'm very impressed with Buddha's compassion and this hopeful message. So you mentioned recontextualization and skillful means. And another thing that struck me with the Lotus Sutra is that the Buddha transmits or explains his teaching by telling people stories or parables or myths. And in the Lotus Sutra, there are a lot of parables, like the burning house, the imaginary or ghostly city. I don't know how it is translated into English. And the son, the prodigal son. It's similar but has difference with the biblical story of the prodigal son. So I think you can develop now on the skillful means and recontextualization these stories. Maybe you can tell us one of the Lotus Sutra stories. I think it can depict or illustrate a little what is this environment of the Lotus Sutra.
Sure. So as you alluded to, the Lotus Sutra contains a number of parables, And of course, usually there's a famous list of 7 parables, although technically there are a few more that are not usually classed in that list. But as you mentioned, these parables are used in order to make clear that which is difficult to understand. And I suppose I can enter into this discussion, explain how that works and how skillful means is utilized in, and recontextualization is developed over the sutra by tacking on to what we just discussed in a funny way. And that is, in the passages where the Buddha informs us that he only teaches bodhisattvas, and therefore that we will become Buddhas, he couples these remarks over and over again with passages telling us that the knowledge and wisdom of a Buddha are difficult to understand, difficult to believe, difficult to enter into. In that context, enter into implies practice. So we have these 3 things. They're difficult to have faith in, they're difficult to understand properly, and they're difficult to practice, to live out. And we're told that generally speaking, only a Buddha together with a Buddha can fully fathom the true characteristic of all dharmas. Now, there are a lot of incredibly important terms nested there, but in very brief, the reason I mention this passage here is that this statement is coupled with passages telling us that the Shravakas and the Pratyeka Buddhas and even high-level bodhisattvas cannot manage it. They cannot understand it properly. It's not possible. Only a Buddha together with a Buddha is capable of this. And yet, it's those same sections that tell us that when I taught people the Shravaka methods, that is to gain the cessation of suffering for themselves and exit rebirth. When I taught beings the Pratyeka Buddhayana, that is to be awakened to the causes and conditions of reality and those basic fundamental laws. When I taught beings that they were to become bodhisattvas, the Bodhisattvayana, and divided them in this way, I was actually only ever teaching the one vehicle, the Buddhayana. In other words, they were all really training to be Buddhas. And so we can't simply look at the passage that says only a Buddha together with a Buddha can fully understand and not realize that we, in discussion with the Buddha, are a Buddha together with a Buddha. And it's that conversation that begets that true fathoming, that true comprehension of the true characteristic of all dharmas, what in Japanese is known as Shouho Jiso, Zhufa Shixiang in Chinese. And the reason that I flag that here is because that is what we are attempting to recreate. Or let me put it the other way around. We are attempting to understand the true characteristic of all dharmas, and therefore the Buddha is attempting to create with us that discussion between one Buddha and another, because it's in that space that we understand. And it's in that capacity that the sutra utilizes skillful means specifically. And for those who are unfamiliar, skillful means very simply is the presentation of things that are not true with a capital T, but are truer than the positions we currently hold, and therefore move us in the right direction, move us towards that which is genuinely true, per se. So this seems like a fairly simple, obvious mechanic. And most teachers do much the same thing. They tell a student part of the story, and gradually they unravel the other details. The Buddha uses these parables, for example, the parable of the burning house, in which we are described as children mired in our desires and our joy of ignorance. And I suppose we can say joy of ignorance precisely because the house is described as dilapidated, full of dangers and falling apart, and there are beasts and ghouls inhabiting the ruins of this place. It is clearly a dangerous locale for us to reside. Nevertheless, when the father, the elder of the household, realizes that a fire has broken out within the house, he encourages the children to leave. He tells them that there is a fire, that things are very bad, and that they must leave. In other words, he does not use any skillful means in that presentation. He tells them precisely what the problem is. There is a fire, the house is dangerous, leave. And they don't listen. They are not receptive to this idea. They remain at play. And so the father utilizes his knowledge of his own children. He utilizes his knowledge of what they like, what their ideas are, the toys they enjoy, and he promises each one a particular cart. Now, modern children enjoy playing with toy cars, and perhaps this is a similar situation. These children enjoy carts. And so we have these three different carts, one for each of the children. And the father specifically offers a cart that matches the particular child's likes and dislikes. And of course, that is the application of skillful means. The Buddha, and any skilled Dhamma teacher really, should gauge the individual whom he is teaching and adapt his message accordingly. And of course, when the Buddha does this, the children race out of the house. In fact, we're told that they essentially fight with each other to get out first in order to gain their gift. And when they leave the house, instead of receiving the three different carts that they were promised, they all receive a single cart, a great white ox cart. And this great white ox cart, of course, is the Buddhayana, the Ekayana, the one vehicle. What is significant about that element of the story is that it is not by seeking out the one vehicle that the children were saved from the house. In fact, it is precisely by doing otherwise. In other words, it is precisely by chasing that which they desired, that which their predilections already predisposed them to, that they escaped the household. Now, of course, the household is symbolic of samsara. And to add to our worldview image here and how things begin to change and shift and get recontextualized, the following of desire par excellence in this example is precisely what removed them from suffering, as opposed to the common sense, standard understanding of desire as being the root cause of the issue. And so, in some sense, very basically, there's a lot of layers to this, but in some sense, this gives us the value of skillful means and the way in which the Buddha utilizes it, but the way in which we have to be very careful here, the skillful means themselves are transformed, are reframed, are recontextualized by the truth with a capital T, the one vehicle, the original intention, the one great matter for which all the Buddhas entered the world. And that changes everything. In other words, the Shravakayana is not destroyed in this story. The Pratyeka Buddhayana is not destroyed in this story. The Bodhisattvayana is not destroyed in this story. They are opened up precisely by following the Shravakayana, the Pratyeka Buddhayana, the Bodhisattvayana. By precisely doing that, you are following the Buddhayana. You are in the one vehicle. It's not by the negation of those things. And so once again, it is not by the negation of dukkha per se that you are liberated in a very basic sense. Of course, I'm simplifying a little, but again, we see how this recontextualization works. So you mentioned the biblical story of the prodigal son, for example. And of course, there is a parable in the Lotus Sutra that parallels in some ways, although there are differences, this story. And the differences are quite significant, actually, in the end. But while we're noting these biblical similarities, I might add that anyone familiar with the biblical tradition might be aware that biblical texts are what we call typological texts. In other words, events, characters, ideas in one part of the text will prefigure or point towards events that occur in other places. So very simple examples are in the biblical tradition, of course, are things like the opening of Genesis. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Spirit moved over the face of the deep, of the waters. And of course, in the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, if my memory is correct, we of course have the Word made flesh, and of course we see those lines at the beginning of Genesis as types, as prefiguring, as pointing towards the idea of the Trinity. At least a Christian reader would probably see that in that light. The Lotus Sutra is definitely this kind of typological text, and that is part of its mechanic of recontextualizing. So it does this in a few ways. There are events and ideas from prior to the Lotus Sutra that are recontextualized by events in the Lotus Sutra in general. And then there are events or passages or ideas in earlier chapters of the Lotus Sutra that prefigure or point towards events that occur later on. So, for example, I mentioned that chapter 2 says only a Buddha together with a Buddha can fully fathom the true characteristic of all dhammas. Well, this remark is prefigured, pointed towards in the Infinite Meaning Sutra that comes just prior to the Lotus Sutra, in which an almost identical passage occurs. Only a Buddha together with a Buddha can understand it. The Bodhisattvas even are incapable of this. And then that passage in chapter 2 is prefiguring, pointing towards the events that occur in chapter 11 onwards, in which a stupa appears and opens, and inside the stupa is a Buddha, and he shares his seat with Shakyamuni. And so we then literally have the personification, the visual representation of a Buddha together with a Buddha. They sit together sharing the same seat. We have this symbology repeated. And the reason this is significant in the case of the Lotus Sutra is not just that this works chronologically. Remember, we have to understand this concept of the three vehicles are in fact the one vehicle. It's not that we get rid of the three vehicles and replace it with the one vehicle. Precisely by being the three vehicles, they are the one vehicle, right? And in the same way, this back and forth mechanism of signs and types and symbols is not just chronological, but is supposed to go backwards and forwards. The earlier remarks will be understood in relation to the later remarks, but the later remarks will stimulate memory of those prior remarks, and they influence each other. There can be no one direction correspondence. It has to be both directions. And that's more important in some cases than others. But likewise, this is related to this type of typology, and this recontextualizing is in some sense related to what makes the Lotus Sutra unique. It is, in fact, though many people don't notice it, the actual teaching that is going on here. A lot of people have the very unfortunate experience of reading the Lotus Sutra for the first time and wondering where the teachings in fact were. There are lots of passages that tell you how magnificent the teachings are, and there are passages telling you that the teachings will begin soon, and then all of a sudden it switches and says the teachings that were just given were really fantastic. Did you like them? And of course some people are left wondering where in fact that content was. But I should point out here that an appreciation, or the way in which one appreciates this mechanic, is the genuine difference between, say, the Tiantai Tendai tradition and the other traditions that also revere the Lotus Sutra, specifically the tradition stemming from Nichiren. Because you can come to slightly different conclusions depending on how thoroughgoing this application is. And perhaps we can get into that if that's interesting at some point. But so in a nutshell, the Lotus Sutra is about taking everything you think you know about Buddhism, about the canon in general, about what a Buddha is, and flips it on its head. It puts it into a new context and asks you what looks different. How does that change what you thought you knew? In fact, what are the implications if I do this, if this is true? And therefore, the Lotus Sutra is a meta-doctrine. It is a teaching about teaching, rather than a specific teaching per se. The teaching about teaching is precisely its goal and its aim. And that's precisely why, in fact, the title of the sutra is Sadharma Pundarika Sutra in Sanskrit, or of course in Chinese Miaofa Lianghua Jing, and in Japanese Myoho Renge Kyo. In other words, literally the Sublime Dharma Lotus Flower Sutra. The first two characters, of course, we know Dharma is fairly simple to anyone who's studied Buddhism, at least in this context. There's a lot of meanings to the term Dharma, but in this context, Dharma is a teaching of the Buddha. But it begs us to ask, what is a sublime Dharma, a marvelous Dharma? What makes something this kind of Dharma? And of course, it is that sublimity is located precisely in this quality. That is the ability to take what was already present. That is the three vehicles. That is everything that was already there and already known, and to shift it just a little bit in such a way that you see it anew. You see it in a way that changes everything. And it couldn't change everything if it did away with everything else. And in fact, this is precisely why there is a medieval Tendai text known as the Kangaku Chushin, I believe. I could be wrong on the title. It's been a while since I read it. But that text, in fact, is quite interesting because it makes a remark that might sound very strange from someone who claims to uphold the Lotus Sutra, and that is the Lotus Sutra itself is without an essence. It takes as its essence that which came before it. In other words, that is a pre-modern description of what I just suggested using the language of a meta-doctrine. It is not a specific teaching per se. It is the ability to shift, to recontextualize, to the traditional terminology for this is to open up the provisional to reveal the real. 开传现实, 开公現実, right? In Japanese, 開公現実, for those who are more familiar with that. So this is absolutely tied up in the mechanism of the Lotus Sutra of what the significance of skillful means is. Because it's very easy to, and I suppose that's why I'm digressing a little bit here, because these are they might seem very simple, but they're quite complex discussions. Skillful means, as I said, in a very simple sense, is using provisionally true things to help people understand deeper truths, let's say. And yet, if I left the description at that, it might imply that once you understand that deeper truth, the provisional truths are no longer useful. They can be discarded, removed. They are tentative. But this mechanism of recontextualizing specifically, emphatically, points to the fact that we cannot do that. The ultimately true can only appear as these stories, as these parables, as these provisional truths, as the three vehicles, as the other texts of the Buddhist canon. And it is precisely by applying this lens of the Lotus Sutra that the real is revealed in them, right? Not just, and of course, once we do this, at least in the Tiantai Tendai view, once we have this understanding of how skillful means fits into the Buddhist picture, and once we understand how the provisional is opened up, is revealed to be the one great cause, the one thing that they came into the world to do, rather than just tentative provisional things to be discarded per se. Once we understand this, then we can look to any other sutra. I can look at the Avatamsaka Sutra, and it can be, just like the Lotus Sutra, a lens that opens up the real in other texts. You might wonder then, why is the Lotus Sutra still significant? If I can just remove the center and then take any text and use it in the same way. Well, the key is that the context of the Lotus Sutra is necessary. Without that context, none of this happens. And so it still has, in some sense, that distinct quality to it.
Thank you for mentioning this recontextualization and this typological character of the Lotus Sutra, and you related it to the Gospel of Saint Matthew in some way, and so I can make a pun saying that the Lotus Sutra is the good news, because Gospel means good news. So the Lotus Sutra would be a good news of the Buddhism. We can say
absolutely, that. Absolutely.
So I want to ask you about the tower or the stupa that arises in the Lotus Sutra in the ceremony of the air or air ceremony. But before I ask that, you explained the sublimity and the wisdom, the title of the Lotus Sutra. But could you explain a little about the symbol of the lotus flower? Why is it in the title? What is the meaning of the symbol of the lotus flower?
Sure. So I'll start with the title, and then I can move on to the tower, perhaps. So as I mentioned, the first two characters, Myoho, literally means sublime dharma, Myofa, right? Sadharma, or correct dharma. And of course, we saw how you have dharma, and that is modified by sublime, right? It's a special kind of dharma. Well, the term lotus flower within the title is a parabolic, a parable almost of that process. And that's why they come together. You have the two characters of sublime dharma and then lotus flower. So before I explain that in depth, the obvious backdrop that comes to this text from basic Buddhist concepts, of course, is the idea that the lotus flower itself is a symbol of Buddhahood, in as much as a lotus flower can only grow from amidst murky, muddy depths. Although the process is quite an interesting one, of course. It grows from the mud, the grime. If we apply this to the human condition, it grows from the dukkha, the suffering and the angst of the world. And yet, if the water as well is dirty and grime-filled, a lotus flower will not continue to grow. It will die off. It's not a particularly robust plant when it comes to contamination in the water. And so it grows through the clear, beautiful water and blossoms above that whole process. Now, of course, there's a lot of symbolism there, the obvious being that the mud straight away implies or symbolizes the samsaric vicissitudes of the world, and that the pure, clear water in some sense represents the nirvanic purity, and yet the flower rises above both of those, transcends the distinction between the two. And that is what it is to be a Buddha in very, very simple terms. But in the specific context of the Lotus Sutra, how does the recontextualizing lens add to this term lotus flower? Well, when you have a lotus flower, you have the flower and you have a seed pod. You have the inner part of the flower. And the seed pod will, the two require each other. You cannot have one without the other. There is no flower without the stamen and seed pod in the center. And of course, there would be no stamen and center seeds that without the protection of the flower, right? And of course, this is symbolic once again of this relationship between the sublime Dharma, the one vehicle, the true characteristic, that is the truth the Buddha intends to impart, and the provisional, skillful means that are the necessary, not just useful, but the necessary presentation, manifestation of that. And therefore, one cannot stand without the other. The two are inseparable. They are identical in any tangible, concrete way. And so the title itself represents this. And so we have the Dharma itself, that is that this text is about the sublime Dharma, that is the doctrine being discussed per se. And then we have this symbol for that process of the lotus flower. And so that is why early Tiantai practices include recitation of the title in various places, because it's symbolic of this core concept. And of course, naturally, this is why it becomes so significant in the Nichiren traditions as a standalone practice. So that's, I'm glossing a bit there because in fact, Zhiyi has a text known as the Fahua Suanyi, or the Hokke Gengi, the profound meaning of the Lotus Sutra. And a great deal of that text is simply an unpacking, using the title as a mnemonic marker for all of these various key doctrines and concepts. So we could speak about that for the next eternity, in fact. But hopefully that gives a basic overview. If it's not quite clear, please, don't be afraid to ask. In relation to your question about the stupa that I mentioned of Prabhutaratna, or many treasures, Bodhisattva. Now, it's very hard to give a simple overview of the layers of symbolism at work in this parable. In fact, this parable is probably one of the more dramatic visual representations of a lot of these ideas. So for those unfamiliar with the stupa, very, very, very simply and very quickly, the stupa emerges in chapter 11 of the Lotus Sutra, and we're told that this stupa of 7 treasures emerges from the earth. The earth splits asunder. It's a very dramatic scene. The earth splits asunder, and a stupa rises from within the earth and settles in empty space, literally, above the ground. And we have to understand on a... so a stupa, in case someone doesn't know, a stupa is probably familiar to most Western audiences in its East Asian guise as a pagoda. And you might have seen pictures from places like Japan and so forth. But we have to understand that the backdrop, the context for this, remember, we always have to have a mind for what recontextualizing is going on in these stories. The context is that traditionally a stupa is the site or location of a portion of a deceased Buddha's ashes or relics. So although in actuality it turned out a little bit differently, we're told in the Agamas, in the early texts, which are equivalents. They're not quite the same, but they're equivalents to the Pali Canon, for example. We're told in that class of texts, in the Agamas, that it was intended that there were 4 sites in which stupas should be built and the Buddha's relics interred. The first one was at the site of his birth, at Kapilavastu. The second was at the site where he attained the way, so that is Bodh Gaya, under the Bodhi tree. The third is where he first turned the Dharma wheel, so that is in the Deer Park. And the fourth is where he entered Parinirvana, that is his cessation, passing away, and that was between the Shala trees, the twin Shala trees in Kushinagara. So that's the context, usually, for a stupa. The audience is expected to know this. And again, this tells us straight away that we can't, if the Lotus Sutra truly means something to us, we can't throw away what came before. Because without that context, the significance of what's just about to be said disappears. So that context, that's where stupas should be built. And yet in this stupa, we have a complete form of a Buddha, and he's not deceased but living. So straight away we know something very strange is going on. Something odd and unusual is clearly being implied by this process. Now, let's start with the simplest level of symbolism here. The Buddha is known as many treasures, and the stupa is distinctly referred to as a stupa of 7 treasures. Now, traditionally, in fact, this passage, this symbolism has been used in the Tiantai Tendai school as a basis for the idea that both insentient things and sentient things have Buddha nature. Why? Because the Buddha inside this proverbial stupa is described as many treasures, many jewels. And in both Sanskrit and in Chinese, Ratnatva in Sanskrit, or Baoxing, literally jewel nature, or maybe in English we might say something like precious nature, might be the better translation, is a synonym for Buddha nature. And the idea of this Buddha within is clearly reminiscent, within the stupa, is clearly reminiscent of this idea of Buddha nature as some essence, in the sense of a capacity for Buddhahood within a being. And likewise, the stupa itself, the physical materials of the stupa, the wood, the tiles, the steps, various parts, are made of insentient things. They're non-sentient, they are not living per se. And yet they are likewise, just like the Buddha within, described as 7 treasures, right, of 7 jewels. And so it, in a very basic sense, of course on its own it wouldn't be used, but in a very basic sense, this implies that the physical world, the insentient, likewise shares in this single precious nature, if that makes sense. So that's a very, very basic, even just the name of the Buddha and the description of the stupa itself gives us that symbolism. Why does it appear, though? Why does the stupa appear? Is an important question. Well, a voice bellows from within the stupa and tells us. It gives us that answer very, very nicely. And it tells us that this Buddha, Prabhuttaratna, made a vow long, long ago that wherever any Buddha preaches the Lotus Sutra, he will appear to verify the truth of the words being spoken. In other words, these teachings sound a little bit strange. These recontextualizations sound a little bit strange to anyone who has studied basic Buddhism in some ways. And therefore, there is perhaps the danger that someone might doubt what is being taught. Is this really what the Buddha wants us to do? And, it seems to flip on its head all of these basic assumptions that we had. And so his job, this Buddha's job, is to appear, to manifest, and therefore prove the veracity of these words. And of course, a Buddha would not make a vow to appear somewhere for no good reason, and certainly not for a lie. Right? So on a very fundamental level, that's what the stupa is doing, per se. The stupa is verifying what has just been said. On a slightly subtler level, let's look at the symbolism of the stupa emerging from the earth, let's say. Again, there's a recontextualization happening here that requires knowledge of the canon. So when the Buddha first attains enlightenment in the early and common scriptures to every form of Buddhism, we're told that he's challenged by Mara. Mara tells him, tries to tempt him with power and then with lust via Mara's beautiful daughters. And the Buddha remains unmoved, and he tries to get the Buddha to be angry. He tries various tactics and none of them work. And finally, he tries to question the Buddha's authority. He says, okay, maybe my plans haven't worked, but how dare you? Who are you? Who are you to say you are a Buddha? You are vanquishing, the ills of samsara. On what authority do you speak? And of course, in the early canon, the Buddha touches the earth. He simply touches the earth. Now, there's a lot of layers to the meaning of that story too, but in our purpose here, remember that this is in response to the question, what is your authority? In other words, the Buddha doesn't say, I come on behalf of this God, or on behalf of this scripture, or on behalf of this or that other authority. The ground of samsara, the earth upon which he sits, the verifiable that you and I and he shares, is the only authority on which he speaks. Right? So there's clear symbolism going on there right at the beginning of the Buddha's story. And of course, this, in a funny way, gets recontextualized in the Vimalakirti Sutra. And the Vimalakirti Sutra has a very irreverent episode in which the Buddha is asked, you describe the Pure Lands of various other Buddhas, and there are always these beautiful places full of wonderful things, and the ground is level, and even the birds chant the Dharma, and it's wonderful. And yet, Shakyamuni, didn't you tell us that this Saha world where we're living now is your Pure Land? And Shakyamuni, of course, says, yes, of course it is. And very irreverently then he's asked, does that mean you are not as pure as you claim to be? Because the land itself appears to be very impure. And in that case, he puts instead of touching the earth, he puts his foot off his seat. He takes his foot off his seat and he puts it on the earth, and the earth is suddenly transformed into a pure land. And in that context, the implication of a very similar event that's supposed to draw parallels with that earlier event, in this context, the symbolism is of course that when the mind is pure, the land is pure in that context. And then once again, those two events we can see mirrored here in a distinct way. The earth splits open. The authority for Shakyamuni's teaching of the Lotus Sutra is the stupa that emerges from the earth. And the same symbolism, of course, occurs again later when the bodhisattvas of the earth emerge. Once again, the authority for this teaching. So again, we have to keep this typology, this prefiguring in mind. On top of that, the fact that the stupa floats into the sky instead of sitting upon the earth, let's say, there is many layers of symbolism there as well. Now, you may be aware that the Tendai tradition divides the Lotus Sutra into two halves. The first half of 14 chapters, which we call usually in English is called the trace gate, or semblance gate, what in Japanese would be shakumon or jimen in Chinese. And then the latter half, which is called the origin gate or the fundamental gate or the fundamental section, let's say, the bunmen, honmon. And the reason that the Tiantai school divides the sutra in this way is not because one half is more important than the other. Remember, the three vehicles and the one vehicle are now both important, but because the nature of the text shifts somewhat. The nature of the text shifts and shifts gear a little bit. And in much the same way, we have a similar process occurring with this shift in location of where things are happening. So you mentioned the floating into the air, the assembly in the air, and its relation to the stupa. So for those who are unaware, when we talk about the Lotus Sutra, we often point out that there are 2 locations and 3 assemblies, is the simple way of putting it. So the 2 locations are that the Lotus Sutra is preached on Mount Gudrakuta, that is the Mount Vulture Peak, Gudrakuta Parivarta, right? And then it is preached in the air, in empty space, in the sky above. So there's the 2 locations. But there are 3 assemblies because the initial assembly is located on Vulture Peak and therefore called the Assembly of Vulture Peak. And then the assembly is raised up into the sky around the stupa in the middle section of the text. And therefore that is the assembly in the sky. And then finally, they return to the ground in Vulture Peak from chapter 22 until 28, 21. Yeah. And so we have our 3 assemblies and our 2 locations. If we can continue the symbolism of the idea that this stupa might be like a Buddha nature or Dharma par excellence, right? Then the idea that it emerges from the earth, much like the lotus flower emerges from the grime and mud of samsara, the earth, right, where we are, and then floats in empty space. In other words, just like in the water, it is in the pure, unbounded ness of emptiness and purity, and then it returns to the earth. And that's interesting. Instead of blooming above this process, it returns to the earth. In other words, once one has understood those, of course, in the Tiantai context, once one has understood those 2 truths, you return to the mean, the middle, the Zhongdao, in the understanding now that the 2 are not as distinct as they once seemed. So once again, we have embedded symbols used there to describe clearly significant ideas. One thing that we should keep in mind, of course, is that another contextual marker that has been hanging in the background here is that if you read, for example, the Pali Canon, you'll come across the Milindapanna Sutta, Dialogue of Milinda, and in that sutra, you will be told that there can only ever be one Buddha in a single world and a single age, and specifically that there's no purpose for more than one Buddha. And then, of course, in the Abhidharma Kosha of Vasubandhu, you have a number of reasons which tell us that literally a world system can only support a single Buddha at any one time. And then you have even the Mahaprajna Paramita Upadesha, the Great Perfection of Wisdom treatise, which is ascribed, at least in the East Asian tradition, to Nagarjuna, which likewise tells us there can only be one Buddha in a single world system. And yet, for the Lotus Sutra's claim that we are all to become Buddhas and to make sense of the only a Buddha together with a Buddha, something here has to shift. And of course, we have that shift physically in the appearance of the stupa, in the appearance of the Buddha within it. And of course, if we compare it back to that passage, only a Buddha together with a Buddha can truly fathom or fully fathom the true characteristic of all dharmas. We have Shakyamuni preaching the Lotus Sutra. But the only way that the truth of that Lotus Sutra is verified, is proved, is made tangible, is when another Buddha appears. It's only a Buddha together with a Buddha that can reveal the Lotus Sutra par excellence, which is the true characteristic of all phenomena. So once again, this symbolism goes backwards and forwards. It's a very tightly nested text, and this is why, even though the text may appear to be very simple on a first reading, it's in fact incredibly complex. I mean, even taking these components of the stupa parable and the fact that the stupa, the beings want to see the Buddha inside the stupa, but the stupa will not open or cannot be opened, according to Shakyamuni, until all of his, what he calls partial embodiments, are gathered back to him. And when these partial embodiments are gathered back to him, then the stupa can open and the Buddha within can be viewed by everyone in the assembly. Well, for those who know a little bit about Mahayana philosophy, they will know that Buddhas, when we talk of Buddhas, we say that Buddhas possess three bodies, Trikaya, a Dharmakaya, which is literally a Dharma body, the Dharma as essence of a Buddha. And we have the Nirmanakaya and the Sambhogakaya. Right? And one of those is the beautiful adorned body of a Buddha, that is the recompense that comes from his perfection. And the other is his manifestation in various forms for particular beings. And once again, we have those three bodies here in this parable, because we have a timeless, unceasing Buddha from the distant past. That's how we know that he is unceasing, right? A Buddha from the distant past who is unceasing, who appears, and therefore, and why does he appear? He appears to verify the nature of the Dharma. So he is this unconditioned Dharma body, this Dharma essence that appears. And we have Shakyamuni here on the earth, representative of this pure adorned Buddha body per se. And then we have all of his partial bodies, his manifestations in various places that must be drawn together. Right? And so we have these three bodies of the Buddha drawn together here. And of course, in the Tendai system, this also correlates with the three types of Buddha nature, but that's a slightly different topic. So even in the symbolism that's occurring, almost as a matter of course, there are clearly implications, deep implications, that require a substantial knowledge of Buddhist ideas to make sense of in any meaningful way. And just to tie in what we said about the original meaning of a stupa, its original meaning was for a partial body of a deceased Buddha, and there were 4 locations where those stupas should be built, right? To note the 4 significant sites of a Buddha's life. Well, earlier in the Lotus Sutra, we were told that wherever somebody reads and recites, studies, copies, and practices as it is preached, this Lotus Sutra, a stupa should be built there. And the reason given to us is because it is precisely in those places where this teaching is taught and studied and practiced and copied. It is in those places that all Buddhas of the 3 times attain the way, preach the Dharma, enter parinirvana. So the same 4 sites, you have to have knowledge that those 4 sites, you're not told this in the Lotus Sutra, but that those 4 sites are usually the sites of a Buddha. of where a stupa for a Buddha is made. And we have this suggestion now. It's almost to use a slightly unflattering term, we have a bait and switch. Usually a stupa is for a Buddha, and this is the locations where this happens. Now it's for the sutra, and these are the locations, that are equivalent to those 4 locations. And of course, that symbolism is once again physically present in this story of the emergence of the stupa, because the Shakyamuni is preaching the Lotus Sutra, and what happens? A stupa emerges precisely in that location. So once again, it's a to and fro, back and forth of these symbols. And when we're not aware of that, when we don't appreciate that, we really miss what makes this sutra special, because it's not in specific concepts. A lot of people often say, this doctrine is specific to it, this is specific to it. But actually, in most of those cases, they're not unique to the Lotus Sutra. What's unique is this recontextualizing, this opening up the provisional to reveal the real. You remember what I said before? Well, this is what I meant. This is what was underlying that. And once again, the two lose their distinction because I can't understand the real, the true meaning without that original understanding of something else that happened earlier. So yes, there is a great deal of symbolism in even just this single parable that goes into many, many pages. And unfortunately for readers of Western languages, texts like the Faha Wenju or the Hokkemongu, Juyi's text on the words and passages of the Lotus Sutra, has not yet been translated. So it's not available in Western languages. But a lot of what I've just talked about here comes from that text, from Juyi unpacking a lot of the symbolism that is going on in that passage.
Oh, it is so profound. Thank you. Yes, I have I think it's the last question. It is regarding what you said about bibliographical sources. So I think, I don't know, there is an English translation that you think it's good, and can you recommend commentaries that is available in English about the Lotus Sutra?
Sure. So we're quite lucky in some ways, in not just English, but in Western language, European languages more broadly, because we do have quite a number of translations of the Lotus Sutra available to us. Before I say what I would suggest as good and that I can verify are reasonably accurate, maybe I'll just say a quick word on what we lack and what sometimes can cause issues. The first thing that we have to understand is, at least if you're an East Asian Buddhist, the Lotus Sutra always means the threefold Lotus Sutra, or what we sometimes call the tripartite Lotus Sutra, literally the 3 parts, right? And that's because the Infinite Meaning Sutra is understood to be almost like an introduction. It's a short sutra. It's understood to be an introduction to the Lotus Sutra, precisely because it is a description of the infinite meanings and the Buddha entering the infinite meaning samadhi, which the first chapter of the Lotus Sutra tells us is the samadhi that the Buddha must be in before he preaches the Lotus Sutra. And so there's a clear connection there. And then the sutra ends with the contemplation of Samantabhadra, or the practice of the contemplation of Samantabhadra Bodhisattva Sutra. And the reason for that, of course, is that the 28th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, in some sense, gives an overview or introduces this practice. And then that sutra itself is a slightly more detailed manual, essentially, for that practice, that contemplation. So for an East Asian Buddhist, the 3 always go together. And part of the symbolism that goes back and forwards, you can see across those boundaries as well. Unfortunately, in translation, that is not always the case. So it is very common, most of the translations of the Lotus Sutra contain only the Lotus Sutra. And of course, that's not a significant issue in the sense that you could always supplement it with translations of the other two sutras. But if you just take a translation of the Lotus Sutra, you will lose some of those illusions that traditional authors and traditional schools and perhaps your teachers will be referring to. Having said that, the most accurate translation of the Lotus Sutra in English, for example, is probably the translation by Leon Hurwitz. Leon Hurwitz did a translation, I believe, in the 1980s. And his edition does two things quite well. First, it attempts wherever possible to mirror the Chinese word order and the structure of the Chinese sentences. Obviously, it has to change somewhat for English. It's not a word-for-word match. But the reason it does that is because it's trying to ensure that it doesn't lose any of the nuances that might be there in the Chinese passages. And the second thing he does, which is very useful, is that he compares it against the current or the presently extant Sanskrit text of the Lotus Sutra. Now, that's not a simple process because the current Sanskrit texts that we have are much later manuscripts than the Chinese. The Chinese is much older and therefore probably represents perhaps an earlier recension or a different recension of the text. So it's not always a word-for-word match, and we shouldn't assume just because the Sanskrit's different that perhaps it's the original in this case. So I'd add that caveat for someone using it. But in any case, where those two manuscripts differ greatly, Leon Hurwitz includes as a endnote the translation of the Sanskrit, so you can compare the two. So that's quite useful. And as I say, his is perhaps the most word-for-word accurate to Kumarajiva's translation into Chinese. It's not perfect. There are a few places where I think he misses some key terminology, perhaps. And sometimes that's because he's trying to mold the Sanskrit onto the Chinese, and sometimes that's a difficult thing to do. But I would definitely recommend his translation to anyone serious about grappling with the text and trying to understand some of the deeper symbols, because it is closest to the words in Chinese. Another good one is the edition by the BDK English Tripitaka series, the BDK Bukkyo Dendo Kyokai, so the Buddhist Transmission Society. And they are in the process of doing an English Tripitaka series, and for that series, they have translated the Lotus Sutra. Once again, it doesn't include the opening and closing sutras of the Infinite Meanings and the Samantabhadra, but they do have another volume called the Tiantai Lotus Texts, aptly. And I believe that volume has those two sutras, so you could supplement it with those. Once again, a very good edition. The translation is quite accurate. There's a few editing errors that occur. That's the only caveat I would add there. Some of the names of bodhisattvas in the opening are missing. But I believe that they have rectified that for future editions. Another very recent publication which I would recommend is the translation done by the BTTS. The BTTS is the Buddhist Text Translation Society. They are essentially the students or the institution established by the Chan master Xuanhua in California, I believe it is. But the reason that their edition is quite good, and I would recommend it to individuals seriously interested in the Lotus Sutra, is that first, because this is a translation that's been done in an East Asian tradition, it is attempting wherever possible to render key terminology in ways consistent with the commentarial materials. So it makes it easier for you to trace key terms. The other very, very useful quality to that version is that it includes the Chinese of Kumarajiva's version in the back. And so anyone who is learning or might want to learn can use this as a reader, or at the very least, they can compare, because each passage is numbered. So you can compare the English to the Chinese, and therefore you can at least work out key terms, what characters are being used. You can look those up, which is quite useful. The other thing valuable about this is that separate from the volume that is the Lotus Sutra translation by the Buddhist Text Translation Society, is a series of books by the now late Master Xuanhua, which were essentially his commentary on that text. For those who are interested in the Lotus Sutra, it's quite a thorough treatment. However, the only caveat I would add is that Master Xuanhua was not a Lotus Sutra specialist. So there are some areas where the commentary is good, but perhaps does not identify some of those deeper layers that are clearly present. If you want to strike a middle of the road translation, in other words, one that has the benefits, for example, of having the opening and closing sutras together with it, and reads fairly well, I would recommend the translation known as the Threefold Lotus Sutra, which is the translation by Bunno Kato and published by Rissho Kosekai. A new edition has recently been published of that version, which I've looked over briefly, and as far as I can tell, the new version is reasonable. It's reasonably accurate. It's not perfect. No translation is, but nevertheless, there are certain editorial decisions made that may not represent the text, but may represent editorial or audience-based concerns. So, for example, I believe in the newest edition of that. So if you don't want these things that I'm about to describe, then I would recommend the older edition of their version. But for example, in the newer edition, they attempt to remove any gender-specific language. And so, of course, that might be useful for some audiences, but in some places that might shift meanings across passages. It depends which ones we're talking about. So someone needs to be aware of that when they're looking at the text. Nevertheless, still quite a good translation. The last thing I'll say about translations, however, is that not only do we lack an edition as accurate, let's say, as the Hurwitz version, that includes the opening and closing sutras as well, but we also lack any serious annotated editions of the Lotus Sutra. I believe that I'm blanking on the name, but my recollection of quite a famous German translation, if I find it, I can send it to you if I find the name, but there's quite a good German translation of Kumarajiva's Chinese, which does include a reasonable amount of annotation for those who can read German. Nevertheless, all of the current English editions are very, very sparsely annotated. They do not include, for example, any cross-references. So any of the typology that I've laid out here is not clear in any of those versions, really. Unless you're doing the groundwork yourself, you'll probably struggle. We also do not have any concordances in English that allow us to look up passages and key terms and those kinds of things. So, of course, that is yet to be done. Hopefully one day we can remedy that situation. But that doesn't mean that it's hopeless, of course. The translations are quite good, and they get you into the text if that's what you wish to do. And certainly, anyone who wants to go further than that, I would recommend, if you're not interested in studying the primary languages, I recommend a qualified teacher. It doesn't matter what school you get that person from, but as long as you can find someone who knows a lot in particular about this text, then you're likely to have some of those gaps filled in and some of those shortcomings, shortfalls remedied. The last thing I'll say about translations is a lot of people, because of the layers of meaning that can be found in the Lotus Sutra, want to use translations that make things easy for readers to understand. And that's definitely, unequivocally, absolutely useful, right? Skillful means, at the end of the day, is definitely crucial. The only thing I would recommend is if someone is using a translation like that. So, for example, the translation by Gene Reeves is quite like that. He tries to match concepts and make the language quite easy for people to understand. I would recommend that you use that in conjunction with a literally accurate translation, because there will be times where you might come to conclusions that are not found in the text because you're extrapolating from something that was designed to point out a particular point and you may have taken it elsewhere. So if you're using translations, I recommend that you use more than one. If you really care about understanding the Lotus Sutra, I recommend that you pick a few. And hopefully that will will open up the provisional of the translation and reveal the real that is underneath.
So thank you so much. I think that's it. It was a lecture. So thank you. Really, thank you so much. I
hope it wasn't too difficult to follow.
I will share this video with more people. The last interview, it has more than 300 views, so it was very, very good. So thank you so much again for this lecture. And I don't know, do you have any final comments?
Sure. I suppose I would close by saying some of the things I spoke about here may sound quite complex, and some of the things I discussed may be a little bit hard to follow, especially if you're new to this kind of thing. And I would encourage viewers to do two things. First of all, please don't assume that because I've spent time studying this text that this isn't a living, practical guide to life for me. It definitely is. But in the context of this discussion, I wanted to give some information that isn't necessarily easily Googleable. I wanted to give some information that does plumb some of the depths, at least a little bit, so that people can see that there is a lot going on here. So first, as I say, the first point I'd make is please don't think that just means that I just intellectually revel in the text alone. It's very important to me, and it is a very practical text. And certainly, of course, it should be applied to your practice and your life more broadly. And the second thing that I would say is that given the fact that there is so much richness within the pages of this book, if you read the translations, if you get more interested in the Lotus Sutra or Buddhism more generally, and it means something to you, if it's significant to you, then I would say to all of you, why not look into learning how to read the original? You don't have to, of course. Not everyone has to. But the experience of being able to read, for example, Kumarajiva's Chinese translation and know that you, and if you're in the Tendai tradition, Zhiyi and Saicho and Zhanran, we're all looking at the same pages, the same text, the same words, and thinking and ruminating and practicing based on these words. And if you're from a Japanese tradition like the Nichiren tradition, knowing that Nichiren was using the same version, this experience is beautiful, unbeatable. Not easy, but it is a wonderful experience. And even if you put a little bit of effort into that process, it will be of immeasurable value. And of course, if anyone is interested in the Lotus Sutra, I'm always available to discuss it with people, to teach people, either in English or even if you want to learn the classical Chinese, we can go through that together. So I'm always happy to teach the Lotus Sutra. It's very important to me. I hope it will be important to some of the viewers. And I hope this was at least somewhat informative, even if difficult to understand, as to some of the beautiful and rich teachings that are contained in this very, very peculiar book.
So thank you so much. It was a great lecture. Thank you. So I will close the transmission now.